The chandeliers of Ashford House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching on crystal droplets that threw dancing prisms across the crowded ballroom where the cream of London society had gathered for the height of the season. And in the corner near the French doors stood Miss Eleanor Hartley, her hands wrapped around the worn silver handle of a teapot that had grown familiar as her own heartbeat these 8 years past. The music swelled from the orchestra gallery, a quadrille tonight, something light and fashionable, while silk skirts rustled past her station like waves against an unremarkable shore, and Eleanor poured with practiced grace, her movements so accustomed to invisibility that ladies often spoke over her as though she were merely an extension of the refreshment table itself. She had learned to cultivate this transparency, this ability to serve without being truly seen, for it was easier than the alternative, easier than remembering what it felt like to be one of them, to wear silk instead of serviceable muslin, to dance instead of pour, to be courted instead of commanded. The weight of the teapot strained her wrist, and she shifted it carefully, mindful of the fine bone china cups arranged before her, each one worth more than her monthly allowance from the Dowager Lady Pemberton, who had offered Eleanor this position out of old friendship with her mother, and perhaps some lingering guilt for not intervening when Eleanor's father had faced his financial ruin. 8 years had passed since that catastrophe, 8 years since Eleanor had last waltzed across a ballroom floor with hope in her heart and suitors vying for her hand, and now she was 26, firmly on the shelf, even if she had possessed the fortune and connections to aspire to marriage, which she most decidedly did not. A young debutante approached, all pink cheeks and thoughtless confidence, and requested tea without meeting Eleanor's eyes, and Eleanor murmured, "Of course, miss," in the pleasant, neutral tone she had perfected, the tone that conveyed deference without personality, service without soul. The girl swept away without acknowledgement, and Eleanor returned the teapot to its stand, her fingers aching slightly from the heat that seeped through the handle despite the cloth wrapped around it. She permitted herself a moment to survey the ballroom, this glittering world that had once been hers and now existed beyond an invisible but impenetrable barrier, and her gaze swept across the dancers, the matchmaking mamas, the peacocking gentlemen, until a sudden stir near the entrance made her pause. The Duke of Northmere had arrived, newly returned from his estates in the north, and the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea for Moses, every unmarried lady and her mother tracking his progress with the focused intensity of hunters sighting prey, and Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, not hope, never hope, for she had learned that lesson too thoroughly, but perhaps an echo of old grief, a reminder of dreams long since buried beneath the weight of silver teapots and service and survival. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Northmere, moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man born to command attention. His dark hair caught the candlelight as he inclined his head to acknowledge greetings, and Eleanor observed from her corner station that he possessed the bearing of someone who carried great weight with apparent effortlessness, though she thought she detected something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of weariness, of duty shouldered for so long it had become indistinguishable from identity. He was perhaps in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered in his evening clothes, and within moments of his arrival, the matrimonial machinery of the ton had engaged with ruthless efficiency, as ambitious mothers steered their daughters into his path with the subtlety of generals deploying troops, and Eleanor watched the familiar dance unfold, remembering with a sharp pang when she too had been one of those hopeful girls, when her own mother had guided her toward eligible gentlemen with gentle encouragement rather than calculation. The Duke accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and surveyed the ballroom with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between resignation and carefully maintained interest, and she found herself wondering what it must be like to be pursued so relentlessly, to know that every smile directed at you concealed an agenda, every conversation a subtle negotiation for position and alliance. Lady Pemberton herself approached him, drawing forward her niece, a pretty blonde thing who curtsied with practiced grace, and the Duke bowed with equal formality before leading the girl onto the floor for the next set, and Eleanor turned her attention back to her teapot as a dowager with an imperious manner demanded Earl Grey with lemon, speaking to Eleanor as though she were deaf as well as invisible. She poured with steady hands, murmuring the appropriate responses, but her gaze drifted back to the dancers despite herself, watching the Duke move through the figures of the quadrille with mechanical precision, his face a mask of polite attention while his partner chattered brightly. And something in that performance of duty resonated with Eleanor's own careful maintenance of propriety, her own daily theatre of cheerful service that concealed the grief she carried like a stone in her chest. 8 years ago, she had worn primrose silk to a ball much like this one, her hair dressed with real flowers, her dance card filled before she had been there half an hour, and she had believed with the certainty of youth that her life would unfold according to the expected pattern: a good match, a comfortable home, children, the quiet satisfactions of a life well lived within society's prescribed boundaries. Then her father's investments had collapsed, the whispers had begun, the suitors had evaporated like morning mist, and within 3 months her father had taken his own life in his study, while her mother wept in the parlor. And Eleanor's world had shattered so completely that sometimes she still felt the sharp edges of that breaking, still woke expecting to find herself in her girlhood bedroom only to remember. The quadrille ended, the Duke escorted his partner back to her mother, and as he turned toward the refreshment area, Eleanor found herself looking directly into his eyes across the crowded ballroom, and for a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long their gazes held, his dark and unreadable, hers surely revealing too much of the melancholy she worked so hard to conceal, and then a matron stepped into her line of sight demanding tea, and when Eleanor looked again, the Duke had turned away, accepting another introduction to another eligible young lady, and the moment passed as though it had never been, leaving Eleanor to wonder if she had imagined that brief connection, that flash of something she could not name in a stranger's eyes. Weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of Eleanor's circumscribed existence, each day following the pattern she had established over these 8 years of reduced circumstances, and her mornings were spent in the dowager's private parlor, where she helped with correspondence, her neat handwriting transcribing invitations and responses, while Lady Pemberton dictated from her chair by the window, and the afternoons found Eleanor in the still-room preparing tisanes and remedies under the housekeeper's watchful eye, her hands steady as she measured and mixed, finding a kind of meditation in the precise work that required no emotion, only competence. The evenings brought the endless succession of balls and soirees and musicales, where London society displayed itself in all its glittering superficiality, and Eleanor resumed her post at refreshment tables, pouring tea and lemonade and champagne with the same practiced invisibility, her movements so automatic she could perform them while her mind drifted elsewhere, into memories or to the poetry she read late at night when sleep eluded her, and the small room in the servants' quarters felt like both sanctuary and prison. The Duke of Northmere appeared frequently at these gatherings, his presence causing the usual flutter among the matchmaking set, and Eleanor told herself she did not notice the small moments that accumulated like coins in a purse, the way he requested tea from her table, specifically even when other refreshment stations stood closer, the quiet, "thank you," he offered, with actual eye contact rather than the absent dismissal most guests provided, the brief nod of acknowledgement that suggested he saw her as a person rather than a piece of furniture. She dismissed these instances as coincidence, as the natural courtesy of a gentleman raised with proper manners, for she had learned 8 years ago the terrible cost of hope, had felt it shatter in her chest when her father's disgrace had transformed her overnight from eligible young lady to unmarriageable burden, and she would not, could not, allow herself to imagine significance in a duke's politeness to a woman who served his tea. Mary, the lady's maid who had become Eleanor's only true friend in this household, noticed what Eleanor tried so hard to ignore, and one night, as they prepared for bed in the servants' quarters, Mary observed with characteristic directness that the Duke seemed to seek out Eleanor's station with remarkable consistency, but Eleanor shook her head firmly and insisted it meant nothing, that gentlemen of his rank did not concern themselves with women of her situation, and even if they did, it was never with honourable intentions, and she had her pride if nothing else. Her room was small but her own, a luxury in the crowded servants' quarters, and it held her few possessions, her mother's locket which she wore always against her heart, the 3 books she had managed to keep when everything else had been sold to pay her father's debts, a shawl her mother had knitted during the last winter of her life before grief had consumed her entirely. At night, when the house finally quieted and the candles burned low, Eleanor would open her volume of Wordsworth and read by flickering light, seeking in his verses about nature and memory some solace for the ache that never quite left her chest, the longing not for what she had lost, but for what she had never truly had, the security of knowing her place in the world and the comfort of belonging somewhere. The simple human need to be seen and known and valued for herself rather than her utility. The garden party at Richmond unfolded under a summer sun that hung heavy and golden in a cloudless sky, and Eleanor stood at her assigned station beneath the shade of an ancient oak, pouring lemonade into crystal glasses that caught the light and threw dancing reflections across the white linen tablecloth, and the air carried the scent of roses in full bloom, and their perfume almost overwhelming in the afternoon heat, mixed with the green smell of freshly cut grass and the delicate sweetness of the ices being served on the terrace. The ladies moved through the gardens like a flock of brilliantly colored birds in their summer muslins and silk parasols, and Eleanor performed her duties with the same careful invisibility she had cultivated over these 8 years, her hands steady as she ladled the cool liquid, her responses to requests automatic and appropriate, and she tried not to notice when the Duke of Northmere arrived with a party of guests, tried not to track his progress through the crowd as he made his way across the lawn, but her awareness of his presence felt like a physical thing, a heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun. He approached her station with what seemed like casual purpose, and Eleanor's heart began to beat too quickly as he stopped before her table, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear beneath the chatter of the other guests, and he asked about the roses, whether she knew the variety planted along the south wall, and she responded with perfect propriety that she believed them to be Bourbon roses, Your Grace, noting their pink blooms and their particularly strong fragrance, and he nodded as though this information held genuine interest, then commented on the weather, the remarkable clarity of the day, and Eleanor agreed that it was indeed fine, though she felt the absurdity of this ordinary exchange even as she participated in it. For he spoke to her as though she were a person whose opinions might matter, as though she were someone worth conversing with, rather than simply a servant to be directed. Other servants had begun to notice. Eleanor could feel their gazes on her back, and she knew there would be whispers later in the servants' hall, a speculation, and perhaps resentment that she had somehow drawn the Duke's attention. And when he finally moved on with a slight bow that was entirely inappropriate to their relative stations, Eleanor found herself trembling slightly as she poured lemonade for the next guest, her carefully maintained composure shaken by the simple fact of being addressed as though she mattered. That evening, after the guests had departed and Eleanor was helping to clear the refreshment tables, the Dowager Lady Pemberton called her aside to the small drawing room where they sometimes worked on correspondence, and the older woman's expression was kind but serious, as she suggested gently that Eleanor should not mistake a gentleman's courtesy for any deeper interest, that the Duke was known for his impeccable manners and his consideration toward all people regardless of station, but that such kindness should not be misinterpreted, and Eleanor assured her with perfect sincerity that she harbored no illusions, that she understood her place and would never presume beyond it. But that night, alone in her small room with the single candle burning low on her writing table, Eleanor allowed herself tears that she had not permitted in years, and they were not tears of hope or foolish romantic fancy, for she knew better than to hope for what could never be, but rather tears for the reminder of all she had lost, for the sharp contrast between what she had been and what she had become, and the gap between those two versions of herself felt unbridgeable, vast as an ocean, and she wept quietly into her pillow for the girl who had once believed the world held promise, for the woman who now poured lemonade at garden parties and was grateful for even that small measure of security, and when the tears finally stopped, she felt hollowed out and exhausted, but also somehow cleansed, as though she had acknowledged a grief she usually kept carefully locked away. Autumn arrived with its characteristic melancholy, the leaves turning gold and crimson in the London squares, and the air carrying that peculiar scent of decay and transformation that marked the season's passage, and by all reasonable expectations, the Duke of Northmere should have departed for his estates weeks ago, for the season had ended, and duty called him to oversee the harvest and attend to matters of land and tenants that required a master's presence, yet he remained in London with no explanation offered to the curious society matrons who whispered behind their fans about his unprecedented lingering. Eleanor noticed his continued presence at the gatherings that still occurred in this quieter time of year, smaller affairs and musicales, and intimate dinners, where the refreshment service required less staff, but still demanded her attendance, and she felt increasingly unsettled by his constancy, by the way her heart would betray her with its quickened beating whenever he entered a room, and she told herself firmly that his remaining in town had nothing to do with her, that surely a duke had business concerns and social obligations that kept him here, that she was foolish and vain to imagine herself any part of his considerations. At a musicale held in Lady Morrison's drawing room on a particularly fine October evening, Eleanor stood at her station during the intermission between performances, pouring wine into delicate crystal glasses while the guests rose from their chairs and stretched and conversed in the low murmur that passed for polite conversation, and she was reaching across the table to refill the decanter when Lady Cecilia Hertford approached with a small group of her particular friends, young women whose beauty was matched only by their cruelty, and Eleanor had served Lady Cecilia many times over the years, and knew to expect nothing but dismissive rudeness. But what happened next transcended mere rudeness into deliberate malice. Lady Cecilia accepted the glass of wine Eleanor offered, her smile sharp and cold, and then with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, she tilted her wrist and let the dark red liquid spill across the front of Eleanor's plain grey dress, the wine soaking into the fabric and spreading like blood, and her friends tittered behind their fans, while Lady Cecilia said with false concern that, "Oh dear, how clumsy the servants were these days. Perhaps Eleanor should take more care in her duties." Eleanor felt the familiar hot shame rise in her chest, but years of practice allowed her to maintain her composure perfectly, and she curtsied and apologized as though the fault were indeed hers, as though she had somehow caused a guest to pour wine on her, and she murmured that she would retire immediately to clean the stain, and assured Lady Cecilia that there was no harm done, and she turned with as much dignity as she could summon and made her way toward the servants' corridor, feeling the weight of curious stares following her progress across the room. In the hallway beyond the drawing room, away from the eyes of the guests, Eleanor finally allowed herself to stop and take a shaking breath, and she looked down at the ruined dress and felt tears prick at her eyes, not for the dress, which was old and plain, but for the deliberate humiliation, for the reminder that she existed at the mercy of those who could wound her with impunity, and she was raising her hand to brush at the wine stain when a voice behind her made her freeze. The Duke of Northmere stood in the corridor, and his expression was thunderous in a way Eleanor had never witnessed, and his voice when he spoke was tight, with barely controlled anger, as he said that what had just occurred was unconscionable, and Eleanor found herself stammering that it was merely an accident. "Your Grace, these things happen," but he cut her off with a sharp gesture and said, in a tone that brooked no argument, that they both knew perfectly well. It was not an accident, and the air between them felt charged with something dangerous and electric. Eleanor found she could not hold his gaze, could not bear the anger she saw there on her behalf, for she had no right to his defense, and his championship only made her situation more precarious, and she whispered that she must go, that she needed to change her dress, and before he could respond she fled down the corridor toward the servants' area, her heart pounding and her hands trembling, and her mind spinning with confusion and fear, and something else she dared not name. The Duke stood alone in the dim hallway for a long moment after she disappeared, and he felt something shift in his chest, some final barrier crumbling, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer pretend that Eleanor Hartley was simply a woman who served tea at society gatherings, could no longer convince himself that his interest was merely compassionate concern for someone who had suffered misfortune, for what he felt, as he watched her endure that casual cruelty with such quiet dignity, was not compassion, but something far more profound and far more dangerous, and the realization both exhilarated and terrified him in equal measure. The Duke of Northmere returned to his study in the early hours of the morning after the musicale, and he sat at his desk with a single candle burning, while the rest of his household slept, and he found he could not dismiss from his mind the image of Eleanor Hartley standing in that corridor, with wine staining her dress and tears. She would not allow herself to shed bright in her eyes, and he realized with startling clarity that he knew almost nothing about her beyond what he had observed these past months, knew nothing of how she had come to occupy such a position or what circumstances had reduced a gently bred woman to serving refreshments at society gatherings. He began making inquiries the following day, discreet questions posed to those who might remember the events of 8 years past, and what he learned filled him with a mixture of admiration and fury at the cruelty of fortune and society alike. Eleanor's father, Thomas Hartley, had been a gentleman of modest means but good family, and he had made investments that his advisers assured him were sound, placing nearly his entire fortune in a shipping venture that promised remarkable returns. But the ships had been lost in a storm off the coast of Africa, and the company had collapsed under debts it could not honor, and Thomas Hartley found himself ruined not merely in fortune but in reputation, for there were whispers that he had known the venture was unsound and had encouraged others to invest as well. The shame and the suddenness of the reversal had broken him, and one morning his valet had found him in his study with a pistol in his hand, and his life ended by his own action, and Eleanor's mother had lasted barely 6 months after that, grief consuming her until she simply faded away like a candle burning down to nothing. Eleanor at 18 had been left alone in the world with no fortune, no family, and a name tainted by scandal and suicide, and the young men who had danced with her and the families who had welcomed her to their drawing rooms had withdrawn, as though she carried some contagion, and she had faced a choice that would have broken most women of her age and station. The Duke learned that the Dowager Lady Pemberton, who had been a friend of Eleanor's mother, had offered her a position that was charity disguised as employment, allowing Eleanor to maintain some small measure of dignity while providing her with shelter and security, and Eleanor had accepted with gratitude and had performed her duties for 8 years with a grace that spoke to remarkable strength of character. He learned too that before her father's ruin she had been considered an accomplished young lady, that she played the pianoforte with genuine feeling and skill, that she spoke French and Italian fluently, that she had been known for her kindness to those less fortunate and her gentle manners, and the Duke found himself filled with growing admiration for a woman who had endured such catastrophic loss and had chosen survival with dignity over the desperate alternatives that society offered ruined, gentle women. Meanwhile, Eleanor had begun to notice with increasing alarm that the Duke's presence at social gatherings seemed calculated to bring him into proximity with her station, and that he sought out her refreshment table even when others were closer or more convenient, and she felt simultaneously drawn to and frightened by his attention, for she had learned through bitter experience not to hope for what could never be, yet her treacherous heart seemed determined to ignore the lessons that 8 years of servitude had taught her, and she lay awake in her small room at night, arguing with herself about the impossibility of her situation, while some foolish part of her insisted on remembering the warmth in his eyes and the anger he had shown on her behalf, and she knew that such thoughts were dangerous and could only lead to further pain, yet she could not quite suppress the unwanted stirring of feeling that his continued kindness provoked. The rain began as a whisper against the windows of Lady Morrison's townhouse on an evening in late October, and by the time the guests had assembled in the ballroom for what was promised to be an evening of exceptional dancing, the whisper had become a steady drumming that provided a melancholic counterpoint to the bright music of the orchestra, and Eleanor stood at her station near the terrace doors, feeling the cool draught that slipped through the glass and thinking that the rain matched her mood perfectly, for she had spent the past weeks in a state of profound confusion about the Duke of Northmere and his inexplicable attention to her, and she had resolved tonight to maintain strict distance and proper servant's demeanor, no matter how kind his eyes or how gentle his words. The ballroom was especially crowded, for Lady Morrison's gatherings were known for their excellent music and the quality of the supper, and Eleanor found herself constantly pouring wine and lemonade, and answering questions about the refreshments, while trying to remain as invisible as possible, and during a particularly energetic country dance, when the dancers were occupied and the guests gathered near the musicians to watch, she allowed herself a moment's respite and slipped through the terrace doors into the cool night air, breathing deeply of the rain-washed atmosphere and feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly as she stood in the shadowed shelter of the portico. The rain fell in silver curtains beyond the stone balustrade, and she watched it with something approaching peace, grateful for this brief escape from the constant performance of servitude, and she was so lost in contemplation of the storm that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until the Duke's voice said quietly, "Do you never dance any more, Miss Hartley?" And she whirled around in shock, her heart leaping into her throat at both his presence and his use of her name with proper address. For how did he even know her full name when she had never been introduced to him, when she was meant to be anonymous and interchangeable with any other servant. She curtsied quickly, her mind racing, and managed to say with tolerable composure, "I serve your grace, I do not dance." And he moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, and he said in that thoughtful tone she had come to recognize, "That seems a terrible waste," and she did not know how to respond to this, did not know what game he was playing, or why he sought her out in the darkness when the ballroom was full of ladies who would dance with him eagerly. He asked her then about her favorite music, his voice gentle and genuinely curious, and Eleanor knew she should deflect, should maintain her role, should not engage in personal conversation with a duke, but something about the rain and the darkness and the weariness of 8 years of pretending made her answer honestly that she favored Mozart, particularly the Piano Concerto No. 21, and when he asked why that particular piece, she found herself saying before she could stop the words, "For its melancholy hope," and then she caught herself and fell silent, horrified that she had revealed something so personal, something that spoke to the strange contradiction of her existence, where she mourned what she had lost, while still harboring some foolish ember of hope that perhaps life held more than endless service. The Duke said nothing for a long moment, and Eleanor could feel him filing this detail away, could sense his attention focused on her with an intensity that made her want to flee and stay in equal measure, and the rain intensified around them, drumming harder against stone and earth, and they stood in companionable silence that felt both dangerous and oddly peaceful, and Eleanor knew that propriety demanded she return inside, that this moment alone with him in the darkness was improper and could be misunderstood, yet she could not quite bring herself to move, could not quite surrender this strange intimacy of shared rain and quiet conversation, until finally duty and fear won over longing, and she murmured that she must return to her station, and she fled back into the bright noise of the ballroom, leaving the Duke standing alone on the terrace watching the rain and thinking of melancholy hope. The Duke of Northmere sat in his library the morning after the rainy encounter on Lady Morrison's terrace, and he found himself unable to concentrate on the estate reports that his steward had sent from the northern properties, for his mind kept returning to Eleanor Hartley, standing in the rain-washed darkness, speaking of melancholy hope, and he knew with a certainty that both exhilarated and troubled him that he had fallen in love with a woman whose circumstances made any attachment to her a source of potential scandal and social difficulty, and yet he could not bring himself to care about scandal when he thought of her quiet dignity and the strength it must have taken to endure 8 years of servitude with such grace. He was expected to marry well. This he knew with the clarity that came from a lifetime of ducal responsibility, expected to choose a bride from among the appropriate candidates whose bloodlines and fortunes would consolidate estates and secure the succession, and his uncle had sent him several letters detailing the virtues of various young ladies who would make suitable duchesses, but when Alexander thought of the girls he had danced with during the season, he found them all vapid and tiresome compared to Eleanor's substance and genuine character, and he realized that he had been performing the rituals of courtship without any real engagement of his heart until he had begun to notice the woman who served tea at the refreshment tables. He sent a note to his closest friend, Lord Carrington, requesting his presence that afternoon, and when Carrington arrived, Alexander poured them both brandy despite the early hour, and said without preamble that he intended to court Miss Eleanor Hartley. And Carrington, who had known the Duke since their school days, set down his glass and said carefully that such an attachment would cause considerable scandal, given her current circumstances, to which Alexander replied that she was gently born and had done nothing to deserve the reversal of fortune that had placed her in service. Carrington, ever the pragmatist, pointed out that her gentle birth had been 8 years ago, and that now she was regarded as little better than a servant, that society would never accept such a match without considerable resistance, that the Duke's family would be horrified, and Alexander felt anger rising in his chest at the arbitrariness and cruelty of social rules that could dismiss a woman's worth based solely on the accident of her father's failed investments, and he said with heat, "She is less worthy because misfortune struck, because her father made poor decisions and took his own life. She must be condemned to invisibility forever." Carrington, seeing his friend's genuine passion, softened and admitted that he personally saw nothing wrong with Eleanor's character, but warned that the Duke must be prepared for opposition from every quarter, from family and society alike, and Alexander said quietly that he had never been more certain of anything in his life, that Eleanor Hartley possessed more integrity and compassion than any woman of his acquaintance, and that he would rather face scandal with her than security without her. Meanwhile, in the Pemberton household, Eleanor found herself the subject of whispered conversations among the other servants, for several had noticed the Duke's particular attention to her at various gatherings, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalworth, summoned Eleanor to her office and warned her sternly against harboring inappropriate aspirations, reminding her that she held her position through the Dowager's charity and that any hint of impropriety would result in immediate dismissal. And Eleanor, her face burning with humiliation, assured Mrs. Dalworth that she understood her place perfectly and had no illusions about the Duke's kindness, which was surely nothing more than the natural courtesy of a gentleman. She returned to her small room and sat on the narrow bed, feeling the weight of her impossible situation pressing down upon her, for even as she told Mrs. Dalworth and herself that she harbored no hopes regarding the Duke, her treacherous heart insisted on remembering the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her and the genuine interest in his voice when he asked about her favorite music, and she knew that she was in grave danger of allowing herself to feel things that could only lead to heartbreak and perhaps to the loss of the small security she had managed to maintain these 8 years. Yet she could not quite suppress the foolish ember of hope that flickered in her chest whenever she thought of him standing beside her in the rain. The Pemberton Ball arrived on the first Friday of November, and it was known throughout London society as the event of the season, for the Dowager Lady Pemberton spared no expense in creating an evening of exceptional music, exquisite refreshments, and an atmosphere of refined elegance that made every other hostess in the city green with envy, and Eleanor had been given the responsibility of managing the entire refreshment service, which meant coordinating 3 other servants, ensuring the flow of champagne and wine and lemonade never faltered, and maintaining the elaborate display of delicacies that graced the tables in the dining room. And she had spent the entire day in preparation, her hands arranging silver trays and crystal glasses until they gleamed in the candlelight. Her mind focused on the 1,000 details that would make the evening run smoothly and reflect well upon the Dowager who had shown her such kindness. The guests began arriving at 9 o'clock, and Eleanor watched from her position near the refreshment tables as the cream of society swept through the receiving line in their silks and jewels, the ladies' gowns in shades of rose and cream and pale blue, the gentlemen in their severe black evening dress, and she felt the familiar clench in her chest at the sight of the world she had once inhabited and from which she was now forever excluded. But she pushed the feeling down and focused on her duties, directing the footmen to circulate with trays of champagne, ensuring that the dowagers seated along the wall had easy access to refreshments, maintaining the smooth operation that was expected of her. The Duke of Northmere arrived late, after the first dances had concluded, and Eleanor's heart gave a treacherous leap when she saw him enter the ballroom, tall and dark-haired, and somehow separate from the glittering crowd, despite being very much a part of it, and she watched from beneath lowered lashes as he greeted the Dowager and several other guests, expecting him to move toward the dancing, and to select a partner from among the young ladies who were watching him with barely concealed hope, perhaps Lady Cecilia Hertford, who looked particularly beautiful tonight in ivory silk, or Miss Caroline Whitmore, whose fortune and lineage made her an eminently suitable match. But instead, he moved through the room with what seemed like purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd, and Eleanor felt a flutter of panic when she realized he was looking for something or someone, and then his gaze found her at the refreshment table and held, and she saw him begin to cross directly toward her, and every rational thought in her mind screamed that this was dangerous, that she should look away, that she should busy herself with some task. But she found herself frozen in place as he approached. He stopped directly before her table, and she could feel the attention of nearby guests beginning to turn toward them, could sense the ripple of curiosity spreading through the room, and he said in a voice that carried just far enough, "Miss Hartley," and she curtsied automatically, her hands trembling slightly as she murmured, "Your Grace," and the world seemed to narrow to just the 2 of them standing there, while the ballroom held its breath. And then he said, clear and unmistakable, "I find myself in need of a partner for the next waltz," and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as silence spread like ripples on still water, guests turning to stare, conversations faltering, the very air seeming to thicken with shock and speculation, and she managed to say through numb lips, "Surely any young lady here would be honored, Your Grace," gesturing vaguely toward the room full of eligible debutantes. But his eyes never left her face as he replied with devastating clarity, "I am not asking any young lady, I am asking you." And the ballroom had gone completely quiet now, the orchestra falling silent between pieces, every eye turned toward the Duke and the servant at the refreshment table, and Eleanor's panic rose like a tide because this was impossible, this was improper, this would ruin them both, and she whispered desperately, "I cannot, Your Grace," and his response came soft but implacable, "Can you not, or will you not?" Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom pressing down upon her as she stood frozen before the Duke, and she whispered desperately, "You don't understand what you're asking," her voice barely audible above the sudden hush that had fallen over the assembled guests. But his response came steady and implacable. "I understand perfectly. I am asking you to dance with me." And then the Dowager Lady Pemberton was there, moving through the crowd with the authority of age and position, in her face a carefully controlled mask that revealed nothing of what she might be thinking, and she said in a tone that attempted diplomacy, "Your Grace, Miss Hartley is in my employ, and surely there are many young ladies who would be more appropriately." But the Duke interrupted her with flawless courtesy and devastating determination. "Then I request your permission to borrow her services for one dance, my lady." And Eleanor felt her mortification deepen, because he had turned the situation into a request that the Dowager could not possibly refuse without giving grave insult to a duke, and she saw the moment when Lady Pemberton recognized this social trap, saw the flicker of calculation in the older woman's eyes as she weighed the consequences of refusal against the scandal of acceptance, and then the Dowager's gaze shifted to the Duke's face, and Eleanor saw something pass between them, some silent communication that she could not interpret, and Lady Pemberton gave a slight nod and said quietly, "One dance, Your Grace," and stepped back, and the Duke extended his hand toward Eleanor, palm up, waiting. Eleanor stared at that outstretched hand as though it were both salvation and damnation, for she could see the strength in those fingers that were weathered from riding and clearly accustomed to hard work despite his privilege, and could see the steadiness of his wrist and the patience in the way he held his arm extended, not demanding but inviting, and every rule of her existence for the past 8 years screamed at her to refuse and to curtsy and beg his pardon and retreat to the safety of her serving station, yet something in his eyes when she finally dared to meet them stopped the refusal on her lips, for there was no pity there, no condescension, but rather a kind of recognition, as though he saw not the servant in borrowed dress, but the woman she had been and still was beneath the layers of enforced humility and learned invisibility. The ballroom had erupted in whispers now, a rising tide of shock and speculation and gleeful scandal, and Eleanor could feel the eyes of Lady Cecilia Hertford boring into her with hatred, could sense the collective gasp of the assembled matrons and the nervous laughter of young men who did not know how to react to this breach of every social convention. But the Duke's hand remained steady, waiting, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built around her heart to protect it from hope and hurt, and she thought of 8 years of serving tea and being invisible and swallowing her pride and her grief, and she thought that perhaps there were worse things than scandal, perhaps there were worse things than being seen, and slowly, as though moving through water, she placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a warmth that sent shock through her entire body, and she heard the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd as he drew her hand through his arm and led her away from the refreshment table toward the center of the ballroom floor, and the whispers rose to a roar that seemed to shake the very chandeliers, but Eleanor could hear nothing except the thundering of her own heart and the quiet assurance in the Duke's voice as he murmured for her ears alone, "Trust me." And then he was positioning them for the waltz, and the orchestra, after a moment of confusion, began to play, and Eleanor recognized with a jolt that ran through her like lightning that they were playing Mozart, the waltz from the Piano Concerto No. 21, and the piece she had mentioned to him on Lady Morrison's terrace when she had spoken of melancholy hope, and she understood that he had remembered, had arranged this, had planned this entire impossible moment, and as his hand settled at her waist and he began to lead her into the first steps, Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes even as her feet remembered movements she had not performed in 8 years, and she knew with absolute certainty that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Eleanor had not waltzed in 8 years, but her body remembered the steps, as though they had been waiting all this time in her muscles and bones, and as the Duke's hand settled firmly at her waist, and his other hand clasped hers with a warmth that seemed to burn through her glove, she found herself moving with him into the familiar pattern of the waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and he led her effortlessly across the floor with a confidence that made it impossible to stumble, even though her legs trembled beneath her skirts, and she heard him say quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "You're trembling," and she managed to reply through lips that felt numb, "You're destroying both our reputations." But his response came without hesitation. Perhaps some reputations deserve destruction, and Eleanor felt a wild laugh threaten to escape her throat, because this was madness, this was social suicide. This was everything she had learned not to want or hope for in 8 years of careful invisibility. Yet here she was in the center of the Pemberton ballroom, waltzing with a duke, while all of London society watched in scandalized silence. She became aware gradually that the other couples who had been forming up for the dance had stopped, had moved to the edges of the floor, clearing a space as though she and the Duke were performers in some theatrical production, and they waltzed alone in the center of the ballroom under the blazing light of 3 massive chandeliers, while hundreds of eyes watched and judged and whispered behind fans and gloved hands, and Eleanor's internal tumult was so fierce she could barely breathe, for there was shame, yes, burning shame at being the object of such scrutiny, and fear that was sharp and metallic in her mouth, and anger too at him for putting them both in this impossible position. But beneath all of that, rising like floodwater through cracks in a dam, was something else entirely, something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it, and it was joy, fierce and bright and utterly unexpected, the joy of being seen again, of moving to music that stirred her soul, of being treated not as a servant or a charity case or an invisible fixture, but as she was meant to be treated, as a woman worthy of a duke's hand and a duke's attention and a duke's public declaration of regard. The Duke guided her through a turn, and she felt the silk of her borrowed dress swirl around her ankles, and she whispered desperately, why are you doing this?" And his answer came quiet, but absolutely certain, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart stutter, "Because I can no longer pretend I don't see you." And Eleanor felt something break open in her chest at those words, felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble, and the music swelled around them. Mozart's waltz filling the ballroom with its melancholy hope, the very piece she had told him she loved. And she understood that he had arranged this, had requested this specific piece, had planned this entire scandalous moment, and for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, as they moved together across the polished floor, Eleanor was not a servant or a fallen lady or a figure of pity. She was not invisible or diminished or less than what she had been born to be. She was simply herself, Eleanor Hartley, dancing with a man who saw her and valued her and was willing to brave society's censure to claim her. And when the final notes of the waltz faded into silence and they stood still in the center of the floor, his hand still at her waist and hers still resting on his shoulder, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that this moment had changed everything, that there was no going back to invisibility now, that whatever came next, whether ruin or redemption, she had been seen and acknowledged and honored before all of London, and that no one could ever take that away from her. The music ended and they stood still in the center of the ballroom floor, the Duke bowing with the formal precision of his station, while Eleanor curtsied with trembling legs, and the silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the crackling of candles in the chandeliers above and the rustle of her borrowed dress as she straightened, and for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, the entire assembly seemed frozen in a tableau of shock, and then Lady Cecilia Hertford's laugh rang out across the ballroom, high and cruel and mocking, and she called out in a voice pitched to carry, "How quaint, Your Grace! Do you dance with all the servants?" And the words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, and she heard other voices join in the laughter, nervous and uncertain, but gaining courage from Lady Cecilia's boldness, and the sound of it was like a wave breaking over her head, pulling her under, drowning her in shame. But then the Duke's voice cut through the noise, cold and sharp as winter steel, and he said with all the authority of his title and generations of power, "I dance with ladies, something you might aspire to become, Lady Cecilia." And the laughter died as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by gasps of shock, because no one spoke to Lady Cecilia Hertford in such a manner. Her father was an earl, and her dowry legendary, but the Duke's face was carved from ice, and his eyes held such contempt that even Lady Cecilia took a step backward, and Eleanor felt her face burning with mortification and humiliation, because she had become the cause of this scene, this scandal, this impossible situation, and she could not bear it. She could not stand there one moment longer, with all those eyes on her, judging her, despising her, pitying her, and she dropped into the lowest curtsy she could manage, and whispered, "Excuse me, Your Grace." And then she was moving, walking as quickly as dignity allowed toward the servants' corridor, and she heard the Duke call her name, but she did not stop, could not stop, and she fled through the doorway that led to the back stairs and the kitchens and the world where she belonged, or at least where she had belonged until tonight had shattered everything. The ballroom behind her erupted into chaos, voices rising in scandalized whispers and excited speculation, and Eleanor could hear the Dowager Lady Pemberton's voice, attempting to restore order, attempting to smooth over what could not be smoothed, while somewhere the Duke was surely facing a barrage of questions and criticism. But Eleanor could think of none of that, because she had reached the kitchen, and the servants who worked there were staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to envy to anger, and Mrs. Cooper, the housekeeper, was upon her immediately, her face red with fury, and she hissed, "What have you done, you foolish, foolish girl, dancing with the Duke as though you were his equal, as though you had any right? You have brought shame on this household and on yourself, and do not think for one moment that this will end well for you." And Eleanor stood there taking the tirade, because what defense could she offer? What explanation could justify what had just occurred? And around her the other servants whispered and watched, and she saw in their faces that everything had changed, that whatever precarious position she had held here was now destroyed. And Mary, her only friend, touched her arm with sympathy, but even Mary's eyes held questions and confusion, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she could not stay here. They could not face tomorrow and the next day and all the days after, when this scandal would be dissected and discussed, and she would be the fallen woman who had dared to dance with a duke. And so later that night, after the ball had ended and the last guests had departed and the house had finally fallen silent, Eleanor packed her few belongings into the worn leather case that had been her father's, and she wrapped her mother's locket in a handkerchief and placed it carefully among her spare dress and her books of poetry, and she knew that come morning she would leave London, would seek a position in the country where no one knew her name or her story, where she could disappear again into the blessed anonymity she should never have allowed herself to leave, because the Duke's impossible gesture, however well-intentioned, had not saved her but had instead destroyed the fragile existence she had built from the ruins of her old life. And Eleanor understood as she fastened the clasps on her case that some endings were not beginnings, that some gestures of kindness were crueler than indifference, and that she had been a fool to feel, even for those 3 minutes and 47 seconds, that she could be anything other than what circumstance had made her. Morning came too soon, and found Eleanor hollow-eyed and trembling as she fastened the clasp on her father's old leather case, her few possessions packed and ready for a departure she had not yet planned, beyond the certainty that she must leave London, must flee before she had to face another day in the Pemberton household, where everyone would know what had happened, where the whispers and sidelong glances would never cease. And she was reaching for her bonnet when Mary appeared at her door, breathless, with news that the Dowager Lady Pemberton required Eleanor's presence immediately in her private sitting room. And Eleanor's stomach turned to ice because this was the dismissal she had expected, the formal severing of the only lifeline she possessed. And she followed Mary down the servants' stairs with legs that felt wooden and a heart that beat too fast, preparing herself for the loss of even this humble position. But when she entered the Dowager's sitting room, she found the elderly lady seated by the window with her morning tea, and the Dowager's expression was not angry, but rather thoughtful, almost amused, and she gestured for Eleanor to sit and said without preamble, "That was remarkably foolish of you both, and Eleanor opened her mouth to apologize, but the dowager raised one elegant hand to forestall her and continued, "But I have known the Duke of Northmere since he was a boy in short pants, and he is not given to impulsive acts, which leads me to believe that what appeared impulsive was in fact quite deliberate." And Eleanor sat frozen as the dowager revealed that the Duke had called at the house 3 times since dawn, had been turned away each time because it was too early for proper visiting hours, but had left increasingly urgent messages demanding to see Miss Hartley. And Eleanor felt panic rise in her throat like bile, and she said quickly, "I cannot face him. I cannot. He has made my position here untenable, and I must leave London today, this morning if possible." But the dowager was watching her with those sharp eyes that had seen 8 decades of human folly and heartbreak, and she said gently, "Child, I suspect he intends to make your position something else entirely." And Eleanor stared at her in disbelief, because surely the dowager could not mean what those words implied. Surely no one could be so foolish as to imagine that a duke would, that he could possibly. But the dowager leaned forward and took Eleanor's cold hands in her own warm ones and said, "You may choose to run, or you may choose to hear what he has to say, but understand this. Eleanor, you cannot run from yourself. You cannot run from what happened last night. And you cannot run from the fact that the Duke of Northmere waltzed with you before all of society because he chose to, because he wished to, because he has been watching you these many months and has come to some decision about you." And Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, because this was hope. Terrible, unwanted hope, and hope was the cruelest thing of all, because hope could be destroyed, and she had learned that lesson so completely 8 years ago when her world collapsed. But the dowager was still speaking, was saying, "I will not force you to see him, but I will tell you that in 40 years of navigating society, I have never seen a man look at a woman the way the Duke looked at you last night. And if you run now, you will spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." And Eleanor sat there torn between the instinct to flee and something else, something fragile and frightened that whispered, perhaps this once, perhaps against all odds and reason. And finally she heard herself say in a voice barely above a whisper, "I will see him." And the dowager smiled and rang for a servant, and sent word that the Duke of Northmere would be received in the morning room at 11 o'clock. And Eleanor had exactly 43 minutes to compose herself before facing the man who had either ruined her life or was about to transform it entirely. The Duke arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, and Eleanor heard his footsteps in the entrance hall below, heard the butler's murmured greeting and the sound of the morning room door opening, and her hands were trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together in her lap, as she sat in the chair the dowager had indicated, with Mary stationed discreetly in the corner as chaperone and the door left properly open, and then he was there in the doorway, tall and imposing in his dark coat, his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and his eyes found hers immediately with an intensity that made her breath catch. And the dowager rose with a rustle of silk and said, "Your Grace, I shall be in the drawing-room should you require anything." And then she swept out, leaving them alone but for Mary's presence. And Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped before Eleanor's chair. And before she could rise, before she could curtsy or speak or do any of the things propriety demanded, he said in a voice rough with emotion, "I love you." And Eleanor felt the words strike her like a physical force, felt her sharp intake of breath and the sudden racing of her heart, and she managed to say, "Your Grace, you cannot." But he interrupted with fierce conviction, "I can. I do. I have these past months." And he began to speak then, words tumbling out as though he had been holding them back too long. And he told her of watching her at countless gatherings, of seeing her grace under humiliation that would have broken a lesser soul, of observing her kindness to those beneath her station, even when she herself had nothing, of admiring her quiet dignity in circumstances that would have made others bitter or cruel. And Eleanor sat frozen, listening to him describe her as though she was someone worthy of admiration, someone valuable and good, and she tried to protest, tried to say, "But the impossibility, the scandal, your duty to your name and title." And he leaned forward with his hands gripping the arms of her chair and said, "My duty is to choose a duchess who will stand beside me with integrity and compassion, and I have found her." And Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, 8 years of suppressed grief and longing and loss suddenly rising to the surface, and she heard herself say in a voice that broke, "I am nobody. I have nothing. I cannot offer you anything that you need." And Alexander's expression softened, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. And when she did not, he took her hands in his and said, "You are Eleanor Hartley, and you have yourself, and if you will accept me, you have me." And it was a proposal, formal and heartfelt and utterly sincere, and Eleanor sat there with tears streaming down her face, while her heart waged war between the fear that had protected her for 8 years and the hope, the terrible, dangerous hope, that perhaps this impossible thing might actually be real, that perhaps she might be allowed to step out of the shadows and into the light, that perhaps she might be loved, not despite what she had become, but because of who she was. And she looked into his eyes and saw no pity there, no condescension, only a steady certainty that both terrified and compelled her. And she knew that this moment would define the rest of her life, that whatever she chose now would echo through all her remaining days, and the choice, impossible as it seemed, was somehow the easiest and hardest thing she had ever done. Eleanor sat very still with her hands clasped in Alexander's warm grasp, and felt the weight of 8 years pressing against this moment, and she knew she must speak the truth even if it meant losing him, and so she drew a shaky breath and said, "I cannot be what you need, Your Grace. I have no dowry to bring to this union, no connections that would benefit your estates, no political alliances or social advantages, nothing of value except myself, and that is not enough for a duke." And she watched his face, expecting him to acknowledge the reality of her words, but instead he released her hands and slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to his knees before her chair, this powerful man, who commanded respect from peers and servants alike, now kneeling at her feet, and he said with quiet intensity, "You bring yourself, Eleanor, and that is all I require. That is everything I require." But she could not let him dismiss the obstacles so easily, and she pressed on with rising desperation. "Society will never accept me. They will say I am the servant who trapped a duke through cunning or manipulation. They will whisper that I schemed and planned and waited for my opportunity. Your family will hate me for bringing scandal to your name, your sister and your uncle, and all those who depend on the dignity of your title, and your mother." But he interrupted her gently. "My mother is dead these 10 years, and if she had lived, she would have loved you for the very qualities that I love, for your strength and your compassion and your grace under circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser soul." And Eleanor felt her resistance beginning to crumble like a wall worn down by relentless waves. And Alexander continued speaking, and she heard in his voice something she had not expected, a vulnerability that matched her own, and he told her of his isolation, of the loneliness that came with his position, of moving through society surrounded by people, yet feeling utterly alone, because no one saw him as simply a man. They saw only the duke, the title, the estates, the power, and he said that her quiet strength had awakened something in him that he had thought lost forever, had reminded him that connection was possible, that true partnership existed beyond strategic marriages and social maneuvering. And he reached up and brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek and said, "I do not need a society ornament to hang on my arm at balls and display at court. I do not need a woman who will smile and curtsy and say all the correct things while feeling nothing. I need a partner who understands both privilege and privation, who knows the value of compassion because she has suffered, who can stand beside me not as an accessory but as an equal." And Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw reflected there not the impossible fantasy she had feared, but something real and honest and terrifying in its sincerity, and she whispered the truth that had been holding her captive. "I am afraid." And his response was immediate and gentle. "So am I, Eleanor, so am I. But I would rather be afraid with you than certain without you. I would rather face scandal and whispers and social censure with you at my side than spend the rest of my life in lonely propriety without you." And in that moment Eleanor understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it, and she felt something shift deep within her chest, felt the armor she had built around her heart, these 8 years beginning to crack and fall away, and she knew that she stood at a crossroads where one path led to safety and solitude, and the other led to risk and possibility and love, and the choice, impossible as it had seemed moments before, was suddenly clear. Eleanor's acceptance came not as a dramatic declaration, but as a quiet yes, barely more than a whisper. Yet it seemed to fill the morning room with sudden light, and she watched Alexander's face transform with relief and joy so profound that she felt tears spilling down her cheeks again. And he rose from his knees and pulled her gently to her feet and held her hands as though they were something precious and fragile, and for a long moment they simply stood there, while Mary discreetly pretended to examine the curtains, and the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. But then reality began to intrude upon this perfect moment, and Eleanor felt the weight of practical obstacles pressing in, and she said softly, "Your family, Alexander, and your sister and your uncle who controls part of the estate, they will never accept this. They will see me as an interloper and a fortune hunter." And he acknowledged the difficulty with a slight nod, but said, "They will come to know you as I do," though Eleanor could hear the uncertainty beneath his confidence, and she insisted then with quiet determination, "We must do this properly, not as a scandal to be whispered about in drawing rooms, but as a legitimate courtship. I will not have people say that you were trapped or manipulated, or that I schemed my way into your affections." And Alexander agreed, though she could see it pained him to contemplate months of enduring society's whispers and cuts when he wanted nothing more than to marry her immediately. And they began to plan then, with Mary summoned to fetch the dowager, and when Lady Pemberton returned and heard their intentions, she settled into her chair with a thoughtful expression and said, "If we are to do this, we must be strategic. The Duke will court Eleanor openly, but we must establish her not as a servant, but as a lady under my sponsorship, a distantly connected family friend who has been staying with me." And Eleanor started to protest that such a fiction would be transparent, but the dowager held up her hand and continued, "It is not entirely a fiction, child, for I have kept a secret these 8 years out of respect for your mother's wishes and your own pride. But the time for such discretion has passed." And she revealed then what Eleanor had never known, that Eleanor's mother had been her cousin, a connection the dowager had deliberately downplayed to protect Eleanor from the additional humiliation of wealthy relations, watching her reduced circumstances. But now this revelation changed everything, because it meant Eleanor was not merely gentry, but connected to one of the most respected families in England. And Alexander seized upon this with barely contained triumph, saying, "You see, Eleanor, you are not the nobody you believed yourself to be." Though Eleanor felt oddly numb at this news because part of her wanted to be loved for who she was, without the validation of family connections. But she understood that society required such justifications, and if this truth would ease their path, then she would accept it. And the dowager began making plans immediately, speaking of social rehabilitation and careful positioning, and which hostesses might be approached first. And Eleanor sat listening to her future being mapped out, and felt the first stirrings of hope that perhaps this impossible thing might actually come to pass, that she might step out of the shadows, not through deception, but through the simple truth of who she had always been, beneath the servant's dress and downcast eyes. And when Alexander finally took his leave that afternoon, with promises to call again the next day, Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage depart, and touched her lips where he had kissed her hand in farewell, and she thought that perhaps courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to reach for joy, even when every past experience whispered that such reaching would only lead to pain. The months of courtship unfolded with the slow deliberation of winter's arrival, and Eleanor found herself inhabiting a strange liminal space between the servant she had been and the lady she was being carefully reconstructed to become. And Alexander called upon her with unwavering regularity, arriving each Tuesday and Friday afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, with flowers that grew more extravagant as the weeks progressed. First simple violets that reminded her of her mother's garden, then hothouse roses that filled the dowager's drawing room with their heavy perfume, and they sat together in that formal space, with Mary stationed by the door and the dowager occasionally sweeping through to ensure propriety. And they spoke of things both profound and trivial, discovering in those carefully chaperoned hours the architecture of each other's souls. And Eleanor learned that Alexander's childhood had been marked by his own losses, in his mother's death when he was but 17, leaving him to shoulder the dukedom before he had fully become a man. And he confessed that he had built walls around himself, just as she had, protecting against the pain of connection by maintaining perfect ducal distance from everyone. And she understood then that they were both survivors of different kinds of grief, both learning to trust again after life had taught them the cost of vulnerability. They walked in Hyde Park on crisp December mornings, when frost decorated the bare branches like lace, and their breath made clouds in the cold air, and always there was a maid trailing at the required 10 paces behind. But sometimes, when the path curved, and they were momentarily shielded by winter-bare hedges, Alexander would brush his gloved hand against hers, and the touch would send warmth flooding through her, despite the bitter wind, and slowly, incrementally, society began to shift its position like a great ship changing course. For some hostesses, who valued ducal favor more than rigid propriety, began extending invitations to Eleanor for smaller gatherings, afternoon teas and intimate musicales where she could be observed and evaluated. And she moved through these events with the same quiet grace she had once employed while serving refreshments, understanding that she was still being judged, but now as a potential duchess rather than as invisible help, though there remained a vocal faction led by Lady Cecilia Hertford, who spread whispered rumors of scheming and impropriety, and suggested that the Duke had been trapped by a clever servant who had studied his preferences and manufactured his opportunities. And these whispers reached Eleanor's ears through Mary, who heard everything below stairs, and sometimes in the dark, hours before dawn, Eleanor would wake with her heart pounding, and wonder if perhaps they were right, if she had somehow manipulated circumstances even unconsciously. But then Alexander would call again, and look at her with such genuine devotion that her doubts would quiet if not entirely disappear. The small moments accumulated like snowfall, each one delicate and individual, yet together creating something substantial and transforming. And there was the afternoon when Alexander asked about her childhood, and she told him of her father's library, where she had spent hours reading while he worked on his investments, the very investments that would eventually destroy them. And she wept then for the first time in his presence, not the controlled tears of their early encounters, but deep, wrenching sobs for all that had been lost. And he had held her hand and said nothing, because he understood that some griefs required no words. And there was the evening at the Dowager's, when Eleanor played pianoforte for the first time in 8 years, her fingers finding the keys of Mozart's Concerto No. 21, while Alexander stood beside the instrument, watching her with an expression that made her forget anyone else existed. And afterward he had given her a leather-bound volume of Wordsworth, with an inscription that read, "For Eleanor, who understands melancholy hope," and she kept it on her bedside table and read from it each night. And there was the gift of Keats that followed, and then Shelley, until her small shelf grew heavy with poetry, and her heart grew heavy with the knowledge that this man saw her, truly saw her, in ways no one had since her parents died. Her gradual blossoming was noted by all who observed her. For the downtrodden servant's demeanor fell away, revealing the lady she had always been beneath the protective coloring of invisibility, and she began to hold her head higher and meet people's eyes directly and speak with the educated accent she had suppressed for 8 years. And the Dowager watched this transformation with satisfaction and perhaps a touch of guilt for having allowed Eleanor to diminish herself for so long, even if it had been partially at Eleanor's own insistence. And then in February, Alexander's sister Catherine arrived from the country estate, a formidable woman of 35 who had managed Northmere's northern properties since her husband's death, and who approached London with the same efficient skepticism she brought to crop rotations and tenant disputes. And Eleanor had dreaded this meeting, knowing that Catherine's approval or disapproval could influence Alexander's uncle, and thus the family's acceptance. And they met over tea in the Dowager's drawing room, and Catherine had studied Eleanor with sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing, and asked pointed questions about her education and her understanding of estate management, and whether she grasped the responsibilities that came with the ducal coronet. And Eleanor had answered honestly, admitting her ignorance of many practical matters, but expressing her willingness to learn, and her understanding that a duchess served not just her husband, but all those who depended on the estate. And something in her sincerity must have reached Catherine, because the older woman's expression had softened slightly, and she had said, "At least you are not one of those simpering debutantes who thinks being a duchess means wearing jewels and ordering servants about." And later Eleanor overheard Catherine speaking with Alexander in the hallway, her voice carrying through the partially open door as she said, "She is not what I expected, Alex. She has substance, and I think perhaps she understands you in ways that matter more than bloodlines." And Eleanor had pressed her hand to her chest and felt hope flutter there, like a caged bird beginning to sense the possibility of flight. And she understood that she was winning this battle inch by inch, conversation by conversation, that society's acceptance would not come in a dramatic reversal, but through the slow accumulation of these small victories. And as winter began its gradual retreat toward spring, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, impossibly, she and Alexander might actually build a life together that society would eventually, if grudgingly, accept. Spring arrived with an almost defiant beauty, as though nature herself conspired to bless what society still debated, and the crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow in the dowager's garden, while Alexander prepared to formalize his intentions before his family, and Eleanor understood that this gathering at Northmere House would determine whether their courtship could proceed toward marriage, or whether familial opposition would force Alexander to choose between duty and desire, and she dressed with trembling hands in a gown of pale blue silk that the dowager had commissioned, simple yet elegant and appropriate for a lady of modest means meeting her potential in-laws, and the carriage ride to Northmere seemed both too long and too short, and Alexander met her at the entrance with an expression that attempted confidence but could not quite hide his own apprehension, and he led her to the library where his uncle Lord Ashford sat in judgment beside the fire, a man of perhaps 60, with steel-grey hair and eyes that assessed Eleanor with the same scrutiny he might apply to a business contract, and Catherine was there as well, offering Eleanor a small, encouraging nod, and the interrogation began with deceptive politeness, as Lord Ashford asked about her lineage, and Eleanor recited what she knew of her father's family and her mother's connection to the dowager, watching the uncle's face for signs of approval or dismissal and finding only careful neutrality. And then he asked the question she had been dreading. "And what fortune do you bring to this union? Miss Hartley, what estates or investments or connections that might benefit the duchy?" And the room fell silent, and Eleanor felt the weight of 8 years of poverty and invisibility pressing down upon her shoulders. But she met his gaze directly and said with quiet dignity, "I bring nothing but myself and my love for your nephew, Lord Ashford. I have no dowry, no property, no financial value to offer, and if that makes me unsuitable, then I will withdraw now rather than bring discord to your family." And she began to rise from her chair, but Catherine's voice stopped her, firm and clear. "Uncle, perhaps that is precisely what Alexander needs, someone who loves him for himself rather than for his title or his fortune, someone who has known both privilege and privation and can therefore understand the responsibilities that come with great wealth." And Alexander moved to stand behind Eleanor's chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that breached propriety but spoke volumes. And Lord Ashford studied them both for a long moment before his stern expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he said, "I have watched my nephew these past months become more himself than I have seen him since his mother's death, and if you are the cause of that transformation, Miss Hartley, then perhaps you bring more value than any dowry could provide." And Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes as the family's grudging acceptance settled over the room like a benediction, and 3 days later the announcement appeared in the Times. The Duke of Northmere to wed Miss Eleanor Hartley, cousin to the Dowager Lady Pemberton, and society erupted in a cacophony of reactions, ranging from romantic approval to scandalized disapproval, and the drawing rooms buzzed with speculation, and Lady Cecilia led a vocal faction that insisted the match was beneath the Duke's station. But then word came from the palace that the Queen herself had heard the tale and expressed approval of a love match based on character rather than convenience, and this royal benediction silenced most of the criticism, though some continued to whisper. And Eleanor found herself transformed in society's eyes, from invisible servant to duchess to be, a liminal position that afforded her both deference and scrutiny, yet she insisted on maintaining her friendship with Mary and the other servants who had shown her kindness during her years of servitude, and this caused some raised eyebrows among the haute ton, but endeared her to many who saw in her behavior a genuine compassion that transcended class boundaries. And she understood that she was being watched and judged and measured against an impossible standard. But Alexander's steady presence beside her gave her courage to face each social engagement, and as the weeks progressed toward their wedding date, she began to believe that perhaps she might actually inhabit this new role, that the girl who had served tea for 8 years might transform into a duchess who served with grace and compassion, and she thought of her mother and father and hoped they would be proud of who she had become, through all the trials that had seemed at the time like nothing but loss and diminishment. And she realized that sometimes the breaking of one life makes space for the building of another, and that the courage to accept love when it arrives unexpected is perhaps the greatest transformation of all. The wedding morning arrived draped in the golden light of early June, that perfect clarity that seems to exist only in England's brief summer, when the world holds its breath between spring's promise and summer's fullness. And Eleanor woke in the dowager's guest chamber to find Mary already laying out her wedding gown, the Brussels lace cascading like sea foam over the bed's counterpane, and she touched the delicate fabric with trembling fingers and thought of all the impossible distance between the girl who had served tea 8 years ago and the woman who would today become a duchess. And Mary fastened her mother's pearls around her throat, the only jewelry Eleanor possessed that had survived her family's ruin, and she looked at herself in the mirror and saw not the invisible servant or the frightened debutante, but someone new entirely, someone who had been broken and remade, and who carried both experiences like dual strands of the same necklace, and the carriage ride to St. George's, Hanover Square, seemed to exist outside of time, the streets lined with curious onlookers who had heard the romantic tale and wanted to witness the servant who would become a duchess, and Eleanor felt their stares, but no longer with shame, only with a quiet acknowledgement that her story had become something larger than herself, a tale that would be told in drawing rooms and servants' halls alike. And then she was standing at the church entrance with the dowager who would give her away in lieu of her long-dead father, and the organ swelled into life and the doors opened, and she saw the gathered hundreds of society and servants mingled together in a way that would have been unthinkable at any other wedding. And she saw Catherine in the front pew, with tears already streaming down her face, and Lord Ashford standing stern but not unkind, and Mary and the other servants from the Pemberton household seated in places of honor rather than relegated to the back. And then she saw Alexander waiting at the altar, and the rest of the world fell away, and she walked toward him with her heart beating so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. And she thought of that night 8 years ago when her father's body was discovered, and she had believed her life was ending. How she had resigned herself to invisibility and service, and a future empty of joy, and now she walked toward impossible happiness, wearing lace and pearls, and carrying roses that smelled like her mother's garden. And when she reached Alexander, he took her hand, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, and understood that he too was moved beyond his usual composure, and they spoke their vows clearly before God and society, and anyone else who cared to judge, promising to love and honor and cherish until death parted them. And when Alexander placed the ring on her finger, he leaned close and whispered, "I love you," so only she could hear, and they were pronounced man and wife. And the church erupted in applause that would have been scandalous at a more conventional wedding, and the reception at Northmere House unfolded like a dream, Eleanor moving through the receiving line with the same grace she had once employed, while serving refreshments, but now as the hostess, rather than the help, and she made certain to speak with every servant present, and to thank them with genuine warmth that came from understanding exactly what their labor meant. And when the orchestra began the first dance, Alexander led her to the floor, and the opening strains of Mozart's waltz filled the air, the same piece they had danced to that scandalous night months ago. And this time when they waltzed, they were not alone, but surrounded by well-wishers, yet Eleanor felt the same fierce joy of being seen and valued and loved, and she understood that this was the completion of a circle that had begun in heartbreak and ended in healing. And later, as their carriage pulled away from Northmere House toward the country estate where they would spend their wedding journey, Eleanor looked back at the ballroom windows glowing with candlelight and remembered standing at the refreshment table in that very room, serving tea to people who never saw her, and she thought of how impossible it would have seemed then that she would leave as a duchess, as Alexander's wife, as someone who had been found worthy of love, despite having nothing to offer but herself. And she leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder as the carriage rolled through the summer twilight, and felt the weight of the past 8 years lift like morning fog, burning away in sunlight. And she understood that sometimes the longest journeys are not measured in miles, but in the distance between who we were and who we become, and that the bravest act is not enduring suffering but accepting joy when it finally arrives. 5 years had passed since that June wedding. 5 years that had transformed Eleanor Hartley from invisible servant to the Duchess of Northmere, and now she stood in the grand ballroom of Ashford House, hosting the autumn ball, with an elegant assurance that seemed as natural as breathing, though she alone knew how hard-won that grace had been, and she moved through her guests with Alexander at her side, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in that proprietary gesture that still sent warmth through her even after all this time. And upstairs in the nursery their daughter slept, 3-year-old Charlotte with her father's dark hair and her mother's grey eyes, a child who would never know what it meant to be invisible or diminished. And Eleanor paused near the refreshment table and noticed the young woman serving tea, perhaps 20 years old, with careful movements and downcast eyes that Eleanor recognized with a sharp pang of memory, and she approached and spoke gently. "What is your name, my dear?" And the girl startled and curtsied hastily. "Miss Anne Weston, your grace." And Eleanor saw in her face the same mixture of dignity and desperation that she herself had worn for 8 years, and she learned through gentle inquiry that Anne's father had died leaving debts, that her mother lived with relatives in the country, that Anne served the dowager out of necessity rather than choice, and Eleanor's heart ached with recognition. And later that evening she spoke quietly to the dowager and ensured that Anne would receive an invitation to the next gathering, not as a servant, but as a guest, a small act of grace that cost Eleanor nothing, but might mean everything to a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than furniture. And Alexander watched his wife with that expression of profound love and pride that had never diminished in 5 years of marriage, and he understood what she was doing because he had witnessed her transformation and knew that she carried within her both the memory of suffering and the determination to spare others from similar pain. And when the last guests departed and they retired to their private chambers, Eleanor sat at her writing desk attending to correspondence, while Alexander read by the fire, the picture of domestic contentment that would have seemed impossible that night 8 years ago when her father's death had shattered her world, and she thought of that terrified girl who had almost fled London rather than face Alexander's proposal, who had believed herself unworthy of love and incapable of being anything but invisible, and she understood now that her transformation had not begun when she accepted Alexander's hand, but rather in all the small moments before, in the choice to maintain her dignity while serving tea, to show kindness to those below her station when she herself had none, to read poetry by candlelight and refuse to let circumstance destroy her entirely, and the courage to say yes to love when it arrived had been built on those years of quiet endurance. And she set down her pen and looked at Alexander and thought how strange and wonderful that the breaking of one life had made space for the building of another, and that serving tea at balls for 8 years had led to dancing at her own wedding, that the girl who had believed herself nobody had discovered she was, in fact, Eleanor Hartley, worthy of love and capable of joy. And outside the autumn wind rattled the windows, but inside all was warmth and peace, and the gentle contentment of two people who had found each other, despite all the obstacles society had placed between them. Dear listener, perhaps you too have felt invisible, diminished by circumstance, resigned to less than you deserved, and perhaps you have stood at your own refreshment table serving those who do not see you, carrying the weight of loss and disappointment, and the fear that joy will never find you again. Know this, you are seen, even in your quiet moments of service and sacrifice. Even when the world treats you as though you were furniture rather than flesh and blood, someone sees you and recognizes your worth. Love, when true, recognizes worth that society overlooks. It sees beneath the surface to the dignity and courage that sustain you through your darkest hours. Sometimes the bravest act is not enduring suffering, but accepting the good we believe we don't deserve, opening our hands to receive the joy we've convinced ourselves can never be ours. Eleanor's transformation began not when she said yes to the Duke, but when she chose to see herself as he saw her, worthy and valuable and deserving of joy. And that choice is available to you as well. May you find the courage to accept the love and recognition that seeks you, even when fear whispers you are not enough, even when past disappointments have taught you to protect yourself by expecting nothing. May you rest in the knowledge that your worth is inherent, not dependent on status or circumstance, not measured by society's shallow judgments, or your bank account, or your address, or the number of people who remember your name. And may you, like Eleanor, Discover that endings can become beginnings, that the breaking of one life makes space for the building of another, that serving tea at bowls for 8 years can lead to dancing at your own. This story comes to you from Evergreen Tales, and if it touched your heart, share it with someone who needs reminding of their worth, someone who feels invisible or diminished or resigned to less than they deserve. Subscribe for more tales of hope and redemption and love that sees beyond society's shallow judgments. Good night, dear listener. May you sleep in peace, may you rest in the knowledge of your inherent worth, and may you wake tomorrow with courage to accept whatever joy seeks you.